July 14, 1992, 2:47 a.m. A resident in Sacramento, California calls 911 to report sounds of a struggle coming from a neighboring apartment. Police arrive within 6 minutes. They find the door to the apartment slightly ajar. Inside, they discover a crime scene that will haunt investigators for the next 32 years. The victim lived alone in a ground-floor apartment with a sliding glass door that opened to a small patio area. That door had been pried open. The screen was cut. Someone had entered through that door sometime after midnight. Investigators processed the scene immediately. They collected fingerprints from the door frame and the interior surfaces. They photographed everything. They documented the points of entry and exit. They collected biological evidence from multiple locations in the apartment and sent everything to the crime lab for analysis. They had DNA. They had fingerprints. They had a clear method of entry. They interviewed neighbors who reported seeing a suspicious vehicle in the area earlier that evening. They followed every lead. And then the case went cold. For 32 years, the evidence sat in storage. The DNA profile was entered into CODIS, the National Criminal Database, but it never matched anyone. The fingerprints were run through AFIS, the Automated Fingerprint Identification System, with no results. The investigation stalled. New cases took priority. The detectives who originally worked the case retired. The file moved to the cold case unit. The family waited. 32 years of waiting for justice. 32 years of wondering if the person responsible would ever be caught. 32 years of watching other cases get solved while theirs remained cold. But on March 8, 2024, everything changed. Sacramento County Sheriff's deputies arrested a man at his home in Nevada. He was taken into custody without incident. He's now facing charges for a crime he committed in 1992, a crime he thought he'd gotten away with for more than 3 decades. The breakthrough came from the same technology that caught the Golden State Killer in 2018, genealogical DNA analysis, a technique that didn't exist in 1992. A technique that uses consumer DNA databases to identify suspects through their distant relatives. A technique that's revolutionizing cold case investigations across the country. For 32 years, this case was cold. The suspect lived a normal life. He got married. He had a career. He moved to another state. He probably thought the case would never be solved. That 32 years was long enough. That technology would never catch up to crimes committed in the early 1990s. He was wrong. Before we go any further, I need to know something. Where are you watching from right now? Seriously, drop your location in the comments. Are you in the United States, Canada, the UK, somewhere else in the world? I want to see how far this story is reaching. How many people are paying attention to justice finally being served after 32 years? And if you care about seeing cold cases solved, about victims getting justice even decades later, you need to subscribe to Cold Case right now. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single update, and smash that like button because it pushes this story to more people who need to hear it. We specialize in cases that law enforcement forgot, cases that went cold, cases where families have been waiting decades for answers. We dig into the evidence, we follow the new technology, we track the breakthroughs that are finally bringing these forgotten victims justice. This case sat cold for 32 years, but the evidence never disappeared, and in 2024, that evidence finally led to an arrest. This is exactly what happens when cold case detectives refuse to give up, when they use every tool available. When they recognize that time doesn't erase evidence, it just waits for technology to catch up. Now, let's dive into how investigators finally solved this 32-year-old cold case and brought the suspect to justice in 2024. When Sacramento investigators processed the crime scene in July 1992, they followed every protocol available at the time. They collected biological evidence from multiple locations. They documented everything meticulously. They sent samples to the California Department of Justice Crime Lab for DNA analysis. In 1992, DNA technology was still relatively new in criminal investigations. The first conviction based on DNA evidence in the United States had only occurred in 1987, 5 years earlier. The techniques were improving rapidly, but they had significant limitations compared to what we have today. The lab was able to extract a DNA profile from the evidence. They had a full profile from an unknown male. That was huge. DNA evidence that could definitively exclude suspects and potentially identify the perpetrator if they could find a match. But there was a problem. Actually, several problems. First, CODIS, the combined DNA index system that allows law enforcement agencies to compare DNA profiles across jurisdictions, was still being developed in 1992. It wouldn't be fully operational nationwide until 1998, 6 years after this crime. So even though investigators had a DNA profile, they couldn't run it through a national database looking for matches. They could only compare it directly to specific suspects they identified through other means. Second, even after CODIS became operational, it only contained DNA profiles from convicted offenders in certain categories of crimes. Different states had different laws about which crimes required DNA collection. If the perpetrator of this 1992 crime had never been convicted of a qualifying offense or had never been arrested at all, their DNA wouldn't be in CODIS no matter how many years passed. Third, genealogical DNA analysis, the technique that ultimately solved this case, didn't exist in any form in 1992. Consumer DNA testing companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com wouldn't launch until the mid-2000s. The databases that genealogical investigations rely on, databases containing millions of people who voluntarily submitted their DNA to learn about their ancestry, didn't exist. The methodology for using those databases to solve crimes hadn't been developed yet. So investigators in 1992 did everything right. They collected the evidence, they got a DNA profile, they entered it into CODIS once that system became available. They periodically ran the profile looking for new matches as the database grew. They interviewed witnesses. They followed up on tips. They kept the case active as long as they could. But eventually, the leads dried up. The DNA never matched anyone in CODIS. The investigation stalled. After several years of intensive work with no breakthrough, the case went into the cold case files. It sat there for decades, not forgotten by the family, not forgotten by the original investigators, but effectively frozen, waiting for something to change, waiting for new technology, waiting for a break that seemed like it might never come. Let me break down what that means and why this case couldn't be solved for 32 years despite having solid DNA evidence. The DNA profile from the 1992 crime scene was good quality. It was complete enough for identification purposes. If investigators had a specific suspect, they could compare that suspect's DNA to the crime scene profile and get a definitive answer. But without a suspect, the DNA just sat in the database, waiting for a match that never came. Every few years, cold case detectives would review the file. They'd run the DNA through CODIS again, hoping that a new offender had been added who matched the profile. They'd look at new investigative techniques and consider whether anything could be applied to this case. They'd reach out to the family to let them know the case hadn't been forgotten. But nothing changed. The DNA didn't match anyone. No new witnesses came forward. No new physical evidence was discovered. The case remained cold. Then, in 2018, something revolutionary happened in a completely different case. The Golden State Killer, who had terrorized California in the 1970s and 1980s with a series of violent crimes, was arrested after 44 years. The breakthrough came from a new investigative technique, genealogical DNA analysis. Investigators working the Golden State Killer case had DNA from multiple crime scenes, but it had never matched anyone in CODIS despite decades of searching. So they tried something different. They uploaded the DNA profile to GeneMatch, a public genealogy database where people who've taken consumer DNA tests can upload their results to find relatives. The Golden State Killer's DNA didn't match anyone directly in the database, but it showed partial matches to distant relatives. People who shared enough genetic markers to indicate they had a common ancestor with the person who left DNA at those crime scenes. Genetic genealogists then used those partial matches to build family trees. They worked backward from the DNA matches to identify common ancestors, then forward through generations to identify all descendants of those ancestors. They narrowed down possibilities using age, location, and other factors. Eventually, they identified a suspect. His DNA was compared directly to the crime scene evidence. It matched. He was arrested, and he later pleaded guilty. That 2018 arrest changed everything for cold case investigations across the country. It proved that genealogical DNA analysis could solve cases that had been cold for decades, cases where the DNA had never matched anyone in CODIS, cases that seemed unsolvable. After the Golden State Killer arrest, cold case units nationwide began reviewing their unsolved cases with DNA evidence. They started identifying cases that could potentially be solved using genealogical analysis. They began partnering with genetic genealogists and private labs that specialized in this technique. The Sacramento case from 1992 was one of those cases identified for genealogical analysis. It had solid DNA evidence from the crime scene. It had been cold for decades with no CODIS match. It was exactly the kind of case that this new technology could potentially solve. But the process of solving it would take several more years of painstaking work. Genealogical DNA analysis isn't quick or simple. It requires specialized expertise, significant resources, and often months or even years of careful research. The Sacramento County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit began working with the California Department of Justice and private forensic genealogy companies in 2022, 30 years after the crime. They were part of a new generation of cold case investigators who understood this technology and knew how to use it effectively. Quick question before we continue. What time is it where you are right now? Let us know in the comments. I'm curious how many of you are watching this late at night, diving into cold cases that have been unsolved for decades. How many are watching during your lunch break? How many are starting your day with this case? Drop the time in the comments. Now let's talk about exactly how genealogical DNA analysis works and how it led investigators to a suspect 32 years after the crime. The process of genealogical DNA analysis is methodical and incredibly detailed. It requires a combination of forensic science, genetic genealogy expertise, and traditional investigative work. Here's how it unfolded in this case. First, investigators needed to ensure the DNA evidence from 1992 was suitable for genealogical analysis. The DNA had been properly stored for 32 years, but it needed to be reprocessed using modern techniques to generate the specific type of genetic data required for genealogy databases. Traditional forensic DNA analysis looks at a small number of genetic markers, usually 13 to 20 specific locations on the genome called STR markers. These are sufficient for comparing one person's DNA to another, for entering profiles into CODIS, and for courtroom identification purposes. But genealogical databases use a different type of genetic information called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, which examine hundreds of thousands of locations across the genome. The Sacramento investigators had their 1992 evidence reprocessed to generate SNP data suitable for genealogical analysis. This is a delicate process, especially with older evidence, but modern techniques can often extract usable SNP profiles even from degraded or limited samples. Once they had the SNP profile, they uploaded it to genealogical databases. Not directly to consumer databases like Ancestry or 23andMe, those companies generally don't allow law enforcement uploads. But to databases like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA that permit law enforcement use for violent crime investigations under specific guidelines. The profile was uploaded under strict protocols. The databases were searched for partial matches, and they found several. None of the matches were close relatives like parents, siblings, or children. Those would have been easy. Instead, the matches were distant relatives, second cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who shared a common ancestor with the perpetrator somewhere back in the 1800s or early 1900s. This is where genetic genealogy becomes as much art as science. The investigators partnered with professional genetic genealogists who specialize in building family trees from DNA matches. These genealogists began the painstaking process of working backward through history. They started with the DNA matches they'd found in the database. Let's say they found a third cousin match. That means the perpetrator and this DNA match share great-great-grandparents. The genealogist's job is to identify those common ancestors, then trace forward through all their descendants to identify every person alive today who could potentially be the source of the crime scene DNA. This requires access to genealogical records, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage records, census data, obituaries, family trees posted online by amateur genealogists, historical documents. The genealogists build massive family trees containing hundreds or even thousands of individuals, tracking every branch of the family from the common ancestors forward to the present day. As they build these trees, they narrow down the possibilities using known facts about the perpetrator. In this case, the crime occurred in 1992 in Sacramento, so the perpetrator had to be in that geographic area at that time. The evidence suggested a male perpetrator. Age could be estimated within a range based on witness descriptions and the nature of the crime. These factors eliminate many branches of the family tree. The process took months. Multiple genetic genealogists worked on building and verifying the family trees. They had to ensure accuracy at every step, because a single error, a wrong connection between generations, could send the investigation down a dead-end path. Eventually, after examining thousands of individuals across multiple family lines, the genealogists narrowed the possibilities down to a small pool of candidates. Men of the right age range, who lived in or had connections to Sacramento in 1992. who descended from the common ancestors identified through the DNA matches. One name kept appearing in the research. A man who had lived in Sacramento in the early 1990s, who fit the age range, who had no alibi for the night of the crime, who had moved away from California years ago. The genealogical analysis suggested he could be related to the DNA matches in exactly the way that would make him the source of the crime scene DNA. But genealogical analysis alone isn't enough for an arrest. It's an investigative tool that points detectives toward a suspect. It's not direct evidence of guilt. To make an arrest and move forward with prosecution, investigators needed to confirm the genealogical findings with a direct DNA comparison. This is where traditional detective work comes back into play. Investigators needed to obtain a DNA sample from the suspect for comparison to the crime scene evidence. They had several options. They could approach the suspect directly and request a voluntary DNA sample, but that risks alerting him that he's under investigation, potentially giving him time to flee or destroy evidence. They could seek a search warrant compelling him to provide a DNA sample, but that requires showing a judge that they have probable cause to believe this specific individual committed the crime. Genealogical analysis provides strong circumstantial evidence, but courts are still determining exactly how much weight to give it for warrant purposes, or they could use what's called abandoned DNA. If a person discards an item in public, like a coffee cup, a cigarette, or a napkin, and investigators collect that item, the DNA on it can be tested and used for comparison purposes. There's no expectation of privacy for items you throw away in public. Sacramento investigators chose the abandoned DNA approach. In February 2024, they conducted surveillance on the suspect at his home in Nevada. They observed him discarding items in public. They collected those items and sent them to the lab for DNA testing. The lab extracted DNA from the abandoned items and compared it to the 1992 crime scene evidence. It was a match. After 32 years, they had their suspect. The genealogical analysis had pointed them to the right person. The abandoned DNA confirmed it with absolute certainty. On March 8, 2024, Sacramento County Sheriff's deputies working with Nevada law enforcement arrested the suspect at his home. He was extradited to California and charged with crimes related to the 1992 case. He's currently being held without bail awaiting trial. For 32 years, he lived without consequences. He moved on with his life. He probably thought he'd gotten away with it. That 1992 was too long ago. That the case was forgotten. That technology would never catch up. He was wrong. Technology caught up. And now, 32 years later, he's facing justice. If you're finding this information valuable, if you're learning things about this cold case that you didn't know before, do me a favor right now. Hit that like button. Seriously. I know it seems like a small thing, but it makes a massive difference. YouTube's algorithm pushes content based on engagement, and every like tells the platform that this story matters, that people still care about justice even 32 years later. Your engagement helps us bring attention to victims whose cases went cold. It keeps their story alive. It puts pressure on the system to keep working these forgotten cases. So hit that like button, drop a comment, share this video with someone who follows cold cases and needs to hear this story. Now, let's talk about what this case means for the hundreds of other cold cases across the country with unsolved DNA evidence sitting in storage. This Sacramento case from 1992 is not unique. It's one of hundreds, possibly thousands of cold cases across the United States that have DNA evidence but no CODIS match. Cases from the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s where investigators collected DNA, entered it into databases, and then watched the case go cold when no match appeared. For decades, those cases seemed unsolvable. The DNA was valuable for excluding suspects, but without a database match or a specific person to compare it to, it couldn't identify the perpetrator. Families waited for justice that seemed like it would never come. But genealogical DNA analysis has changed that equation entirely. It's providing a path forward for cases that were considered dead ends, and the success rate is remarkable. Since the Golden State Killer arrest in 2018, genealogical DNA analysis has been used to solve more than 200 cold cases nationwide. Murders from 40, 50, even 60 years ago. Cases where the victims' families had given up hope. Cases where the original investigators had retired or passed away. Cases that seemed impossible to solve. These aren't just random successes. These are methodical investigations using proven techniques. The methodology gets refined with each case. Genetic genealogists are getting better at building accurate family trees faster. Labs are getting better at extracting usable DNA from older, degraded evidence. Databases are growing larger as more people submit DNA tests for ancestry purposes. The success in this Sacramento case from 1992 demonstrates several important points about modern cold case investigations. First, evidence doesn't expire. The DNA collected in 1992 was just as valid in 2024 as it was 32 years ago because it was properly preserved. Storage matters, documentation matters, following proper evidence handling protocols matters. Those 1992 investigators who carefully collected and preserved that evidence gave their 2024 counterparts the tools to solve the case. Second, technology eventually catches up. In 1992, genealogical DNA analysis was science fiction. It wasn't even theoretically possible because the databases in the consumer DNA testing industry didn't exist. But technology advanced. Consumer genetics became popular, databases grew, methodologies were developed. And suddenly, cases that were unsolvable in 1992 became solvable in 2024. Third, cold case units need resources and training. The Sacramento County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit didn't just get lucky. They actively reviewed their old cases, identified one suitable for genealogical analysis, partnered with experts who understood the technology, and methodically worked through the process. That requires funding, training, and institutional commitment to solving old cases. Fourth, these investigations take time. This wasn't a quick process. From the decision to pursue genealogical analysis to the arrest took approximately 2 years of work. Building the family trees, narrowing down suspects, conducting surveillance, collecting abandoned DNA, waiting for lab results, building a prosecutable case. Cold case investigations don't move at the speed of fresh cases, but they do move. And fifth, justice delayed is not justice denied. 32 years is a long time, but it's not too long. The victim's family waited 3 decades, but they're finally seeing the person responsible held accountable. That matters. It sends a message to other families waiting for justice. Don't give up hope. Technology is solving cases that seemed unsolvable. This case also highlights why it's so important for people to understand how genealogical DNA analysis works and why participating in consumer DNA databases, even just for ancestry purposes, can help solve violent crimes. When you submit your DNA to a consumer testing company and upload your results to a database like GED Match, you're potentially helping solve cold cases. Not because you're a suspect, but because you might be a distant relative of someone who committed a crime decades ago. Your DNA might be the partial match that helps genealogists build the family tree that leads to a suspect. Some people have privacy concerns about this, and those concerns are legitimate and worth discussing. But many of the major genealogical databases now have clear policies about law enforcement use. GED Match, for example, allows users to opt in or opt out of law enforcement matching. If you opt in, your DNA can be used to help solve violent crimes. If you opt out, it can't. And it's important to understand that being a DNA match doesn't make you a suspect. It makes you a tool for building a family tree. Genealogists aren't investigating you. They're using your genetic data to map family relationships that might lead to someone who committed a crime decades before you were even born. The growth of these databases is directly correlated with the success rate of genealogical investigations. The more people who participate, the more likely it is that any given crime scene DNA will have partial matches that can be used for family tree building. Every person who uploads their DNA makes it more likely that old cold cases will be solved. Before we wrap this up, I want to know something. Do you follow other cold cases? Have you been following a case for years waiting for a breakthrough? Drop the case name in the comments. I'm curious what unsolved cases are on your radar. What cold cases do you want to see solved? Now, let's piece together what happens next in this case and what it means for cold case investigations moving forward. The suspect arrested in March 2024 is currently awaiting trial in Sacramento County. He's facing serious charges related to the 1992 crime. The prosecution's case is built on multiple elements: the genealogical DNA analysis that identified him as a suspect, the direct DNA comparison from abandoned DNA that confirms the match, the physical evidence from the crime scene, and witness statements from 1992. Defense attorneys in genealogical DNA cases often raise several arguments. They challenge the reliability of genealogical analysis, arguing that family trees can contain errors or that the methodology isn't scientifically rigorous enough. They argue that the abandoned DNA collection violated their client's privacy rights. They question the chain of custody for evidence that's been stored for decades. They seek to exclude the DNA evidence or challenge how it's presented to a jury, but these challenges have largely been unsuccessful in cases that have gone to trial so far. Courts have generally accepted genealogical DNA analysis as a legitimate investigative tool, similar to using witnesses or tips to identify suspects. The direct DNA comparison, the match between the suspect's DNA and the crime scene evidence, stands independently of how investigators identified the suspect in the first place. The abandoned DNA collection has also been upheld repeatedly. Courts have consistently ruled that there's no expectation of privacy for items discarded in public places. Once you throw away a coffee cup or cigarette, you've abandoned any privacy interest in the DNA it contains. And the chain of custody for old evidence, while carefully scrutinized, generally holds up if proper protocols were followed during initial collection and storage. The fact that evidence is 32 years old doesn't make it invalid. It just means the prosecution needs to demonstrate it was properly preserved. This case will likely proceed to trial unless the defendant accepts a plea agreement. The DNA evidence is strong. The investigation was thorough. The genealogical analysis will be explained to the jury. And unless something unexpected happens, justice will finally be served 32 years after the crime. After 32 years, the case is sealed. Justice is finally coming. If you haven't subscribed to Cold Case yet, what are you waiting for? We cover cases just like this one. Cases that went cold for years, even decades. Cases where new technology, new witnesses, or new detectives are finally bringing justice. And you don't want to miss what happens next in this case or in the dozens of other cold cases we're tracking. Hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications so you're alerted the moment we drop updates on this case or cover new cold cases being solved with the same technology. The genealogical DNA revolution is just beginning. Hundreds of cold cases are being reviewed right now. Arrests are happening. Justice is being served decades after families thought hope was lost. You've followed the evidence this far. You've seen how strong the case is after all these years. Now stay with us as we watch justice finally unfold. Subscribe now. We've covered a lot of ground in this investigation. 32 years of waiting. DNA evidence that sat in storage for 3 decades, properly preserved and documented. Technology that didn't exist in 1992, but revolutionized cold case investigations by 2024. Genealogical analysis that turned distant relatives into investigative leads. Traditional detective work that confirmed the genealogical findings with direct DNA comparison. And finally, an arrest after more than 3 decades. This case represents the best of what's possible when cold case investigations are done right. The original investigators in 1992 collected and preserved evidence properly, giving their successors the tools to solve the case decades later. The cold case detectives in 2024 refused to accept that 32 years was too long, that the case was unsolvable, that the family would never see justice. They used every tool available. They partnered with experts in genealogical DNA analysis. They methodically built family trees from distant DNA matches. They narrowed down suspects through traditional investigation. They collected abandoned DNA for direct comparison. They built a solid case that will stand up in court. This victim deserved safety and security. The family deserved justice that didn't take 32 years to arrive. But the system failed them in 1992. The technology didn't exist to solve the case then. The databases weren't large enough. The methodology hadn't been developed. For 32 years, the family lived without answers, without closure, without seeing the person responsible held accountable. They endured 3 decades of waiting, wondering if justice would ever come. But their story isn't over. After 32 years, this case finally has resolution. The evidence that was gathered in 1992 has finally led to an arrest. The person responsible will face trial. And if justice is served the way it should be, they'll spend the rest of their life in prison for what they did more than 3 decades ago. This victim can't be brought back. That's the tragedy we can't undo. And we can't give the family back the 32 years they spent waiting for answers. But we can ensure this case finally results in accountability. We can ensure the person responsible faces consequences, even 32 years later. We can ensure the story is told, the case is solved, and the memory is honored with the justice that should have come decades ago. This case was cold for 32 years. But it's not cold anymore. Justice is coming. And it's coming because the evidence never disappeared. Because technology caught up. Because cold case detectives refused to give up. Because DNA that was collected and preserved in 1992 was finally analyzed with the tools it had been waiting for. For 32 years, the suspect thought he'd gotten away with it. He was wrong. Rest in peace. After 32 years, justice is finally here. If this cold case moved you, if you want to see more cases solved after decades, if you believe 32 years is too long to wait but better than never, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Cold Case. We're tracking genealogical DNA investigations across the country. Cases from the 70s, 80s, and 90s that are finally being solved. You won't want to miss these stories of justice delayed but not denied. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Do you think more cold case units should be using genealogical DNA? What case do you want to see solved next? And share this video with anyone who follows true crime and needs to hear that cold cases can be solved, even after 32 years. The wait is over. Justice has arrived, and there are hundreds more cases waiting for the same breakthrough.